Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our program, A Shared History of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. We are joined here by Erin Farley, who is the Library and Information Officer for local history in Dundee, Scotland. She's also the author of the book Angus Folktales, which you can find at Alexandria Library and check out if you would like to read those. It's excellent. And we are joined by Tricia Walker, who is our very own local history and special collections branch manager. So thank you for coming, everyone. If you just tuned in, once again, please leave your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And without further ado, I will turn things over to Erin.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. And I'm going to speak about the process of putting together the walking trail, Breaking the Chains, which is a trail around Dundee city centre, which explores Dundee's historic links to the transatlantic slave trade and also to the anti-slavery movement. And the trail highlights a series of places and place names connected to these stories. Now, it's available both as a physical map, which you can pick up various places around Dundee. It kind of looks like this, a fold-out booklet. And it's also available on the Leisure and Culture Dundee website. And in addition to the city centre trail, there should also be a sort of Google map which highlights places out with Dundee city centre, which also have connections to the slave trade. So that allowed us to kind of widen the places that we spoke about outside of just places where we could expect people to sort of walk in one go. And putting this map and trail together has been a collaboration between Dundee Libraries, in which I was the main contact, and University of Dundee Museums, in which Matthew Jarin was the main collaborator there. And it was also done in collaboration with Woven Together, which is a project looking at Dundee's multicultural history, which is organised by Abertay Historical Society. And that is an organisation that Matthew and myself are both involved with as well. So there's a lot of collaborations across different historical institutions in Dundee went into putting this together. And the idea first was raised by Dundee City Council's Black History Working Group. So the process of putting the trail together was actually quite an interesting one. We started off putting together a big list of sites and street names which had connections to the slave trade. And we decided to sort of narrow this down to a set of places which would be walkable and have that wider map to highlight places further afield in the city. And if you do know Dundee, then you might be aware that a lot of historical sites no longer exist or look anything like they used to. So sometimes it was quite tricky deciding where to put stops. And there is a stop which connects to one of Dundee docks, which is now in the middle of a park because the city has built out into the river so much. But we did also include several sites which do actually still have the original buildings from the time at which the stories we speak about were happening. And since we launched the tour last October, we have had quite a lot of interest from local groups and from schools and university students. So Matthew and myself have done a number of guided walks around the route where we include a little bit more information about the stops in addition to what is included on the map leaflet. Now, Dundee's connection to the transatlantic slave trade itself is something that there hadn't been a lot sort of published or written about prior to us putting this trail together. I think because in some ways Dundee's involvement in the slave trade was often a bit of a remove. It has to an extent been out of sight and out of mind, and there maybe has been a bit of a temptation for the city to kind of go, oh, it wasn't us, we weren't as bad as Glasgow, for example. But the more we started looking into it, the more we realized that the city has so many links and that we needed to start looking into and start talking about. And one of the biggest places that this comes in is through Dundee's textile industry. Now, the city is well known maybe today for being a former sort of jute, juteopolis is one of the names Dundee is known by. But the jute industry really came out of an existing industry processing linen. And the linen trade ended up being very linked to the transatlantic slave trade through Dundee merchants selling a form of rough cloth called Osnaburg. And they sold this to plantation owners to use as clothing for enslaved people there. And through this trade, you know, some real fortunes were made. And we also had several merchants in Dundee who made their own way to Jamaica in order to sort of set up their own plantations there as well. And the organisations involved in creating the trail, which is Dundee University and Dundee Libraries, both feature as stops on the trail ourselves. The university was founded as University College Dundee in 1881. That's the first stop on the trail. And the principal benefactor for the university was Mary Ann Baxter, whose wealth came from her family linen company, Baxter Brothers and Co. And one of their most popular products was the Osnaburg cloth, which was being traded in the Caribbean and United States. And the libraries appear as the Albert Institute. The building is now the McManus, Dundee's Art Gallery and Museum, but this was the first civic museum and art gallery in Dundee. And library opened in 1867, and that's the final stop on the trail. So we kind of come between the two main organisations involved in setting this up. And this was funded by public subscription when it was first set up. And of the subscribers, there's a variety of benefactors, and these also include David Baxter, who was another of the Baxter brothers, and George Armitstead, who was a ship owner who imported guano processed by enforced labour in Peru. And there were also donors involved in setting up the McManus who were involved in the anti-slavery movement too, including the Reverend George Gilfillan, who was instrumental in bringing Frederick Douglass to speak in Dundee several times. And we also sort of noted that the Albert Institute, being named after Prince Albert, has a connection through him as well. Prince Albert was president of the Society for the Extinction of the Slave Trade and for the Civilization of Africa, which was founded after slavery had been outlawed in the British Empire. And although, as the name suggests, it is an anti-slave trade organisation, it's still very in favour of British and European involvement in and profit from African people and land. So that connection with the royal family is sort of worth bearing in mind as well. And we did decide to represent places on this trail which connect with both the transatlantic slave trade and the various campaigns to stop this. And this wasn't necessarily because we wanted to sort of provide balance in that sense, but to show sort of the intertwined nature of these these movements. And also, perhaps in some ways, I think it really highlights some of the cognitive dissonance that people could kind of hold in relation to this here. And it is perhaps worth noting that Dundee did not actually form a first anti-slavery society until 1832, which was a year before the trade was abolished in the British Empire. So there was quite a lot of anti-slavery demonstrations and movements building up against slavery in the United States after this. And one of the most interesting places that this plays out is in the relationship with the Church of Scotland. So there was a split from the established Church of Scotland to set up the Free Church in 1843. And the Free Church sent a deputation to the United States in the 1840s to kind of raise money and support for their new church. And Reverend George Lewis from Dundee was part of this. He went over and wrote an account of his impressions of America. And he does note the evil influence of slavery, but also in several ways makes apologies for slave owners there. And it soon happened that him and his fellow Free Church ministers came under fire for accepting money from American slave owners to fund some of these newly established churches. And this set up a campaign called Send Back the Money, which Frederick Douglass and others were very vocally in support of, encouraging the Free Church to sever its links with American slave owners. And one of the most intriguing stories that connects to Dundee, which we mention on the trail, is the story of Joseph Knight. Now, this connects to Dundee because the Wedderburn family, in the Howth, Dundee's oldest graveyard, one of the stops that we take you to on the trail is the grave of Sir John Wedderburn. Now, this is a well-established family in Dundee, and the Wedderburns, they lost their fortune at Culloden. They were exiled after that battle. And John Wedderburn sort of left with no inheritance and few friends in Scotland, and he sailed to Jamaica along with two of his brothers. And when he gets there, he takes on a variety of jobs and saves up money, and then starts investing in sugar plantations and buys a considerable amount of land and also enslaved people. At one point, he owned 17,000 acres, which is around 10% of Jamaica's land mass. And his fortune was built on the stolen labor of nearly 1,000 enslaved people. And there's also a Dundee place name in Jamaica, which sort of highlights that connection as well. But one of the people that Wedderburn enslaved was a young boy. We don't know his own name, but he was aged around 12 when he came into Wedderburn's household. And Wedderburn called him Joseph Knight, which was a name given to him after the captain of the slave ship which brought him to Jamaica. Now, Wedderburn made Joseph Knight into what he called a houseboy, a domestic slave, and taught him to read and write. And when the family's fortunes were somewhat restored and memories of the politics of the Culloden era were fading, Wedderburn returned to Scotland in 1769, and he re-established the family home. He brought Joseph Knight with him as a servant, and Joseph Knight, when he was working in Wedderburn's house in Perthshire, he fell in love with another of Wedderburn's servants, a woman called Anne Thompson, and the two of them were married. Now, Joseph Knight, he becomes aware around this time that there was a successful case in England which had declared that slavery could not be upheld under English law. Now, it's possible that Knight interpreted this to also apply in Scotland, so he asked Wedderburn for his freedom and for back wages, and Wedderburn did not entertain this, and it transpired that the case did not at that time apply in Scots law. Now, Wedderburn dismissed Joseph Knight's wife, Annie Thompson, from service and refused to allow Knight to go and live with her. And when Knight tried to go anyway, Wedderburn had him jailed in Perth. Now, Knight then managed to persuade the magistrate that he was entitled to his freedom. And initially the court found in Wedderburn's favour, but then Joseph Knight appealed again to the Sheriff Court in Perth. And they concluded the state of slavery is not recognised by the laws of this kingdom. But Wedderburn did not want to give up this fight, so he appealed to the Court of Session in Edinburgh, which was the highest in Scotland. And Wedderburn's argument was based on there being a difference between slavery and perpetual servitude, and that he said that although Knight was not a slave in Scotland, Wedderburn was still entitled to his perpetual service as an indentured servant. But a variety of people were very taken up by Joseph Knight's case for his freedom, and this included Samuel Johnson and James Boswell, who are perhaps best known for compiling the first sort of comprehensive dictionary. But they put together a case which hinged on the argument that no man could be by nature the property of another. And the jury found 8-4 in favour of Joseph Knight and set a precedent that former slaves could be protected under Scots law. Now, this story is one of the sort of most intriguing and sort of emotionally compelling stories that is represented on the trail, I think. Although there are many more sort of unanswered questions and people who I would like to be able to find out more about. And Wedderburn, he really does not seem to have been a very pleasant person at all. He sort of devoted the rest of his life to protecting the rights of slave owners and their financial interests. And we don't really know what became of Joseph Knight and Annie Thompson after the court case. They sort of fade out of the historical record after the case, and I don't know whether that is how they wanted it. But their story is something that has inspired various sort of creative interpretations as well, including a historical novel by James Robertson and a play by Mason Bunyambe called Enough of Him, which has recently come out. So I will start kind of tying things up here, I think, but just that's given you kind of an idea of some of the stories that connect Dundee to the transatlantic slave trade. But what we do want to say is this is very much only the beginning of this research as well. There's so much more to be gone into about the people and the connections on this tour. Yeah, hopefully this is something that Dundee can do as a city over the next few years. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing from Tricia now.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was so fabulous. And the stories you chose to share with us were really fascinating. And I hope to one day to be able to take the Breaking the Chains walk in Dundee in person. So Tricia, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you.
Okay, let me share my screen here. There we go. So my presentation is basically, we're going to be walking through a timeline.
Trisha, I think you're just sharing your desktop. We just lost your timeline.
Hang on. Back?
There we go. Yes.
Okay.
Thank
Dual
you.
monitors messes with me sometimes. Okay, so this is a timeline we put together on the slave trade and both transatlantic and a little bit on the US domestic slave trade. And so basically understanding the context of what's going on with Alexandria here in Virginia, since that's what we're really looking at, is the land that would become Alexandria was purchased in 1669. The area that is Alexandria proper was designated an official tobacco inspection warehouse in 1732. And so that's where basically the origin of the city comes from. And of course, tobacco directly tied to the slave trade because it's what was driving it at that time. In 1749, the city was established. And then as you go through the history of the city, you'll see certain things that have an impact on slavery and on how the city develops. So in 1791, the southernmost cornerstone for the District of Columbia is set at Jones Point in Alexandria. And in 1801, the Alexandria officially becomes part of the District of Columbia. And that ends up being important because there are differences in the laws pertaining to slaves in the District of Columbia versus the state of Virginia. And then we see in 1846 that Alexandria will be retroceded back to Virginia. And there are some very specific reasons driving that retrocession. So another aspect when you're looking at this time period is to look at what's going on in terms of conspiracies and revolts within the state. So we know that there was a Northern Neck conspiracy amongst slaves in 1687. We have Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. But in terms of its later impact, the 1801 Gabriel Prosser's rebellion in Richmond is one to really keep in mind. So in terms of the actual slave trade here on the Potomac River, you can see this map. This is the entire watershed of the Potomac River here. Alexandria is right here. Here's DC. A place called Boyd's Hole is right down here. That was another spot where they dropped off slaves. And then St. Mary's in Maryland was down in this region. And that becomes important because there's actually two British naval districts happening in this area. So the South Potomac district is the Virginia side, the North Potomac district is the Maryland side. The ports of entry for Virginia, Belvoir, and for Maryland, St. Mary's. And Belvoir should be right in this section here. And one of the things to be aware of with the slave trade occurring here is that Virginia, the duties in Virginia versus the duties in Maryland that are paid on slaves. So in Virginia, the duties are assessed based on the cost of the slave. And in Maryland, they're assessed just per head. And so in Virginia, you have 5% duty pre-1754, 10% duty in 1754, and then the Virginia legislature jumps it up to 20% in 1755. And what ends up happening is you see the amount of slave trading ships change tremendously as to whether they're dropping off in the South Potomac district or the North Potomac district. And you can tell, like in 1759, the Virginia legislature makes some additional changes, and that's because they're seeing a tremendous loss of money going into Maryland and not going into the coffers in Virginia. And by 1760, with that change in the duties, you actually see that the slave ships resume coming to the South Potomac district. And so for the South Potomac District, these are some of the statistics that historians have found. 1734 to 1754, they've documented 20 ships that brought in 2,000 Africans on the South Potomac River side. Mid 1754 to late 1760, they cannot document any ships landing on the Virginia side. And the downside to not being able to document any in Virginia is that there's also no ways to document any in Maryland, because the naval records for St. Mary's no longer exist. So it was very key when researchers found this piece right here in the records of a Scottish firm, Buchanan and Simpson, that basically says there are many Negroes imported this year in 1759, and that the duty is vastly higher in Virginia than Maryland, so everybody's selling on the North Potomac side. And if you look at the figures there also, notice 1734 to 1754, they've documented under 2,000. 1759 for that year alone, they've documented 2,000 slaves coming in. And this actually concurs with some of the other stats that historians have found in terms of the natural increase of slavery in the region. They can tell that the amount of slaves in Fairfax and Loudoun and all of that, it cannot solely be due to births. There has to be imports going on for this area for the 1750s, because the genders, a lot more males than females, the ages, all of that just show that it's not slavery increasing through birth, it's slavery increasing through purchases. And another aspect to remember for this particular region, really any region in Virginia, is the connections of families. So Thompson Mason, who was a brother of George Mason, obviously Gunston Hall, down around Belvoir. His brother Thompson owns lands in Virginia. He manages the lands of a widowed sister. And then he also marries the daughter of a Maryland merchant, Abraham Barnes. And Barnes is the person with the connections to the Liverpool slave trade. In particular, he works with James Gildart. And so when he returns eventually to England, Thompson takes over managing all of the Maryland affairs. So we know that he's got to be bringing in slaves. So one of the things that makes Alexandria interesting is this mix. So in 1790, we can document 52 free Blacks in Alexandria. And this is where the information about when Alexandria is part of the district and when it's part of Virginia comes into play. So 1791, that cornerstone was set. 1790, we're documenting 52 Blacks here. In the 1810s, another neighborhood develops called Haiti in the southeast section of the city. And then by 1820, you can see there's 836 free Blacks in the city. However, when Alexandria is retroceded back to the state of Virginia, the free Blacks exit the city, move into DC, or even further north. And so one of the aspects that is interesting to look at is this curtailing of the international slave trade and how the US and the UK interacted in these areas. So we can tell that in 1808, Congress bans the importation of slaves. However, if you look further down here, 1859, smuggling is occurring. So there was never any really stopping of the trade. We can say 1808 because that's the legal banning of it, but we know that people were still being brought in all the way up until the time of the Civil War. And you can see different aspects of what's happening here, like when they're trying to negotiate the treaty regarding piracy and how to handle that, and that they can't come to an agreement. Well, there are reasons they can't come to an agreement. And That will come up a little later when we start looking at ships and what was happening in the Caribbean with US ships. But at this point, there's also a lot of the abolition movement. So we know in Alexandria in 1796, there's this Alexandria Society for the Relief and Protection of Persons Illegally Held in Bondage. This is a society that is primarily led by Quakers in the city, quite prominent Quakers, and they a local apothecary who had an extensive business was part of this. And they routinely cited the Bill of Rights as to, you know, hey, this shouldn't be happening. And they encouraged boycotts of any of the materials that were manufactured or cultivated by slaves. However, there's a reaction from the Virginia legislature in 1798, where they're basically saying any person that incites slaves to insurrection or murder could be punished by death. If you harbor an escaped slave, you'll get fined. And if you are a member of an anti-slavery society, you could not be a juror in any suits where slaves were suing for their freedom. Excuse me. And this is where the rebellions and the insurrections come back into play. Because if you notice, 1801 is the last meeting of this society. And basically what happened is, with the fear that was raised by this rebellion, people just didn't want to be part. It very much killed the anti-slavery movement within the state, and decidedly within Alexandria. So in 1808, with the legal end of the transatlantic slave trade, we see this domestic slave trade arise. And so you can tell up here, Alexandria is here. And what happens is that there's a change from itinerant traders moving around collecting slaves and walking them down in coffles to a much more organized slave trade, where they're sent via sailing vessels, steamers, and coffles. And then in the 1840s and 50s, you can tell that they even started using trains. And this is where the retrocession in Alexandria also comes into play, because what was happening was Alexandria residents did not have Virginia citizenship. They also really didn't have solid representation in the District of Columbia. And so any improvements in transportation, anything like that, were being shut down by Virginia citizens within the federal government. And so that's why you don't actually see a railroad come into Alexandria until 1851. And that is what allows for, like, Richmond, Virginia, to start taking precedence in the slave trade, is that they have trains and they can move things much more easily. So Franklin and Armfield was the largest slave trading organization. And they were based here in Alexandria. And basically you can tell they moved slaves late summer to late spring via ship. So they would come down this section of the coast here. And then in the summer, they would go overland. So they would come this way down through Knoxville, down to Natchez down here. And the reason this coastwise slave trade is interesting is because, depending on the weather, they could get blown off course and end up in the Caribbean. And this is where that treaty comes back and becomes important, and the fact that they couldn't agree to terms on that. Because once they're blown into the Caribbean, there's the ability for the slaves that are on those ships to be freed. And so you can see this in 1831 with the Comet that was owned by Franklin and Armfield, departed Alexandria, heading to New Orleans, they were wrecked on January 3rd. They were towed to Green Turtle Key. And at that point, basically the slaves were seized and freed. And so that whole shipment, in a business sense, was lost. And so there was these fights that were occurring where between the US and the UK about, you can't, these are domestic. This is a domestic trade. And it's like, no, you're in international waters. And so again, in 1833, the Enterprise, same thing, blown off course. And they also ended up, in this instance, with the Young Men's Friendly Institution there, basically applying for a writ of habeas corpus. And all of the individuals, all the slaves on the ship were disembarked, and all but 6 opted to stay in the Caribbean. And the 6 that opted to come back to the US was a mother and children. So in terms of the rise of the slave trade domestically within Alexandria, 1819, you start seeing Alfred managing slaves in and out of Alexandria. But the heyday is really the 1828 to 1836 with Franklin and Armfield. And with their business, they actually could purchase additional ships. So if you were to look in newspapers of the time, and you see the Tribune, the Uncas, and later the Isaac Franklin, all of those were basically slave trading ships. And the Isaac Franklin was specifically designed for human cargo. The other 2 ships could carry human cargo, but would also carry other types of materials, anything that they could get in, whether textiles, tea, all types of goods. So basically they didn't want to leave port without a full load. And then obviously we hit the American Civil War, and that's sort of a break point. But in modern times, we're seeing a lot more work being done to try to make sense and heal. Within the city, we've had this African-American Heritage Trail. So there's a commission that's put together these. Georgetown University has come forth with reparations for descendants of slaves. The Virginia State Legislature is actually setting up to where specific universities that were involved either in the slave trade or had enslaved people working for them and benefited from it, they are creating scholarships for descendants of slaves. Virginia Theological Seminary has also done reparations. And then we also have the Alexandria Community Remembrance Project, which is basically looking at the lynchings and everything that occurred in Reconstruction and up through, the 40s. If you wanted to go online and look at the heritage trails, they are available online. So they're both physically up and down the waterfront in the city, but you can also drop into the story maps that have been created online, and you can actually go through and read the bits about key points within the city. And that's pretty much everything I had. So I will stop at this point. I hope that helped.
Thank you so much. All right, it looks like we're at time. So thank you again to Erin and Tricia, and thank you to all of our attendees for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.